My son was 4 years old when I realized how quickly a family can become dangerous. He was standing in my living room too small to understand why an adult was screaming inches from his face when my stepmother told him slowly, clearly that he was not family and should never call her grandmother again. He started crying before I could reach him, and that was when I saw the blood on his lip, not much, just enough to make everything go still. I looked past her and saw my father standing there, hands at his sides, watching without saying a word, and in that instant I understood this wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad moment. It was a line I had been crossing alone for years. I told her to leave my house, and she smiled and said, "I didn't have the right." 5 minutes later, I called the police, knowing there was no way back from that decision. If you're listening right now, tell me where you are and what time it is there. I really do read those comments, and if you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace until the peace started costing too much, you're not alone here, and you're welcome to stay. Vivian Ward entered my life when I was 14, at an age when I was already practiced at making myself small. She arrived with a polished smile and the kind of calm confidence that made other adults relax immediately. To them, she seemed warm, organized, reasonable. To me, she felt like gravity, quiet, constant, impossible to argue with without losing your footing. My father told me how lucky we were. He said she brought stability. He said I should try harder to get along. And when I struggled, when I pushed back even gently, he used the same sentence every time: "You're old enough to be understanding. Just let it go." So I did. Over and over. I learned early that peace in our house wasn't something you shared. It was something you preserved by giving way. Vivian didn't need to raise her voice. She corrected with looks, with pauses, with the careful withholding of approval. If something upset her, the room changed temperature. Conversations shortened. Doors closed a little more quietly than necessary. My father never called it control. He called it compromise. And because he was the one who decided what words meant, compromise always landed on me. By the time I was an adult, that reflex was automatic. I smoothed things over before they became sharp. I apologized for discomfort I hadn't caused. I learned how to anticipate moods and rearrange myself accordingly. When I met Aaron, he noticed it before I did. He would ask why I went quiet after certain phone calls, why my shoulders tightened when Vivian's name came up. I told him it was nothing. Family habits, old dynamics, things that looked worse from the outside than they felt from the inside. I believed that because believing it was easier than questioning what I'd built my life around. Aaron and I lived in Seattle in a small house that felt deliberately ours. It was the first place I remember choosing without asking permission. Leo was 6 then, my son from a previous relationship, and he filled the rooms with a kind of uncomplicated presence I wasn't used to. He asked questions without fear. He laughed loudly. He took up space. When Noah came into our lives, he was 4, small for his age, with eyes that tracked movement the way kids do when they've learned that adults can be unpredictable. He was Aaron's half-brother, and when we took him in, it wasn't dramatic. There was paperwork, conversations, long nights weighing responsibility against capacity. But the decision itself felt simple. He needed a home. We had one. Vivian disagreed from the beginning. She never said it outright at first. She didn't have to. It showed in what she corrected and what she ignored, in how she praised Leo loudly and addressed Noah only when necessary. Once, when she thought I wasn't listening, she said to my father that Noah was temporary. Another time, she asked almost casually whether we planned to make it official, or if this was just a phase. When I corrected her, when I said Noah was our son, she smiled and changed the subject. Later, my father told me not to make things harder than they needed to be. I told myself I could manage it. I limited visits. I stayed present when she was around the kids. I redirected conversations before they turned sharp. I convinced myself that as long as I was there, nothing truly bad could happen. That belief was comforting, and like most comforting beliefs, it wasn't built to survive reality. As the wedding planning started, Vivian's involvement intensified. She had opinions about everything: the guest list, the venue, the timing. She framed each demand as concern, as experience, as something I would appreciate later. When I pushed back even mildly, she reminded me how much she'd done for us, how much my father had sacrificed, how family required flexibility. The word family kept coming up heavy and undefined, like something you could lose if you handled it wrong. I began to notice how differently she spoke when Noah entered the room, how her tone flattened, how instructions became orders, how affection disappeared entirely. Leo noticed it too, though he didn't have the language for it. He started hovering closer to me when Vivian visited, glancing at Noah before answering questions, waiting to see how things would land. I watched my children adjusting themselves in real time, and a thought I had avoided for years finally pressed its way forward. What am I teaching them by allowing this? I tried to set clearer boundaries: shorter visits, fewer overnights, no unsupervised time. Vivian reacted the way people do when they feel control slipping, not with open confrontation, but with offense. She told my father I was being ungrateful. She asked what she'd done to deserve this treatment. She framed my caution as cruelty, and my father, as always, asked me to fix it, to call her, to explain myself better, to remember everything she'd done for us. What he never asked was whether my children felt safe. The night my father offered to babysit, I hesitated. Not because I didn't trust him, but because trusting him had never meant the same thing as trusting the environment he brought with him. I told him yes, with conditions. I told him Vivian was not welcome. He said he understood. He said it would just be him. I wanted to believe him because believing him meant I didn't have to face how fragile my boundaries really were. By the time I left the house that evening, something in me already knew I was making a mistake. I ignored it the way I always had. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself that family deserved another chance. I didn't know yet how quickly that chance would run out. I came home later than I planned. Traffic had slowed to a crawl on the bridge, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, the sky was already losing its light. The house looked normal from the outside porch light on curtains drawn, but I felt that familiar tightness in my chest before I even unlocked the door. It was the feeling I'd learned to recognize as warning, the one I'd spent years talking myself out of. The first sound I heard was crying. Not the short, startled cry of a child who'd tripped or been surprised, but the kind that comes from panic, sharp and breathless. I dropped my bag and moved quickly, calling their names as I crossed the living room. Noah was on the floor near the coffee table, his hands pressed to his face. Leo stood a few steps away, frozen eyes wide. My father was there too, standing near the doorway like he wasn't sure which direction to face. Vivian was in the center of the room. She was still talking. Her voice wasn't loud anymore. That almost made it worse. She was calm, precise, each word delivered as if she were explaining something obvious. She said Noah needed to learn his place. She said it wasn't appropriate for him to get ideas. She said a child like that didn't belong in a wedding meant for family. When Noah tried to speak, his voice caught, and that was when I saw the mark on his mouth, a swelling lip, the faintest trace of blood. I didn't remember crossing the room, only the sound of my own voice when I finally spoke. I asked what happened. Vivian turned to me, annoyed, like I'd interrupted her mid-sentence. She said he'd been disrespectful. She said she'd corrected him. She didn't deny touching him. She didn't apologize. She looked at my father as if waiting for confirmation. He said nothing. Later, when I tried to piece together the timeline, Leo filled in the gaps in fragments. Noah had been talking about the wedding, about wanting to hold the rings. He'd practiced walking slowly, carefully, the way we'd shown him. Vivian had told him to stop. When he didn't understand why, when he asked what he'd done wrong, she slammed her hand on the table hard enough to make both boys jump. She told him he was lucky to be here at all. She told him to remember that. And when he started crying, confused and scared, she struck him across the face. No one stopped her. Standing there listening, I felt something inside me settle into place. Not anger, not shock. Certainty. I told Vivian to leave my house. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain myself. I didn't negotiate. I said it once clearly. She laughed. She said I was being dramatic. She said my father had every right to be there. She said I was overreacting the way I always did. I told her again. This time my father stepped forward, not toward her but toward me. He told me to calm down. He told me this could be handled privately. He told me she didn't mean it the way it sounded. I looked at him and realized he was asking me to absorb it. The pain, the fear, the damage, the way I always had. So things could stay comfortable. I said no. That word felt heavier than I expected. Vivian's face changed when she heard it. Not anger. Something closer to disbelief. She told me I was making a mistake. She told me I'd regret this. She said I was tearing the family apart over nothing. I opened the door and waited. She left slowly, deliberately, as if daring me to stop her. My father followed. He didn't look back. The house went quiet after that. Too quiet. Noah wouldn't let go of my hand. He flinched when I reached for a tissue. Leo sat on the couch, knees pulled to his chest, watching everything like he was trying to memorize it. I knelt on the floor with them and felt the weight of what I hadn't protected sooner pressing down on me. I told myself not to cry. I told myself to stay steady. I told myself this was fixable. But when I cleaned the blood from Noah's lip and saw the way he avoided the mirror, something in me broke open. I took pictures. Not because I wanted proof, but because a part of me knew I would need it. I wrote down what happened while it was still clear in my head. Times, words, where everyone was standing. I didn't know yet what I was preparing for. I just knew I couldn't let this be rewritten later. That night after the boys finally fell asleep, my father called. He said Vivian was upset. He said she felt attacked. He said this didn't need to go further. He asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted her to stay away from my children. He said that wasn't reasonable. He said families don't call the authorities on each other. He said I should think about the consequences. I did. I thought about Noah's face when she leaned over him. I thought about Leo learning that silence was safer than speaking. I thought about every time I'd been told to let something go so others wouldn't be uncomfortable. And I thought about what it would mean to teach my children that safety was negotiable. The next morning, Noah asked if he was in trouble. He asked if he'd done something bad. I told him no, and I meant it with a clarity I'd never felt before. When I dropped them off at school, my hands were still shaking. I sat in the car afterward longer than necessary, staring at the steering wheel, replaying everything. I knew then that pretending this could be handled quietly was over. The line had been crossed, and no amount of smoothing or explaining would erase it. I didn't know exactly what came next. I only knew that whatever it would be public, and it would be final. The emergency room was brighter than it needed to be, the kind of sterile white that makes time feel suspended. Noah sat on the exam table with his legs dangling, his fingers twisting the edge of the paper sheet beneath him. He didn't cry anymore. That worried me more than the crying had. He answered questions carefully, like he was afraid of choosing the wrong words. When the nurse asked what happened, he looked at me first, searching my face for permission. I nodded, and he spoke in a small, steady voice that didn't sound like a 4-year-old's. The doctor examined his mouth, checked for fractures, documented the swelling. He asked me who was responsible. The question landed heavily in the room. For years, I had learned to soften language to protect people by blurring edges. This time, I didn't hesitate. I said my stepmother's name. I said she struck him. I said it plainly. The doctor nodded once, already typing, and told me they were required to make a report. I felt a strange sense of relief hearing that. Not because I wanted escalation, but because for once, the responsibility wasn't only mine. While we waited, I opened the app connected to our home security system. My hands were steady now. I scrolled back to the timestamp from earlier that evening, found the living room camera, and pressed play. I watched the footage in silence. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. Vivian's hand moving fast, Noah recoiling. The sound of her voice flat dismissive, telling him no one needed him there. I watched it once. Then again. I saved the clip and backed it up in 3 places before my phone battery dipped below 20%. By the time we left the hospital, it was late. Noah slept in the back seat, his head tilted against the window. I didn't go home. I drove to a friend's house instead, someone who didn't ask questions right away. I tucked the boys into a borrowed bed and sat on the floor outside their room, scrolling through information I never imagined I'd need. Emergency restraining orders, child protection laws, reporting procedures in King County. The words blurred together, but one thing stayed clear: waiting would only give someone else time to rewrite what had happened. The next morning, I called a family law office as soon as they opened. My voice sounded calm, even to me. I explained the situation. I mentioned the hospital report. I mentioned the video. The attorney paused and asked me to email the footage immediately. I did. An hour later, she called back and told me we were filing for an emergency protection order that day. The courthouse was quieter than I expected. No drama, no raised voices, just people waiting their turn to be heard. I filled out forms with shaking hands detailing incidents I had spent years minimizing. Dates, words, patterns. I realized how long this had been building without my naming it. When we were called in, the judge reviewed the materials in silence. He watched the video once, then again. He didn't ask for elaboration. He didn't ask me to explain her intentions. After less than 3 minutes, he granted the order. The words felt unreal as he spoke them. No contact, no proximity. Immediate effect. When it was over, I stepped outside and stood on the courthouse steps, the paper folded tightly in my hand. I expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. I felt hollow. Like something had been removed that I hadn't realized was holding everything else in place. My father called that afternoon. His voice was strained, urgent. He said Vivian was devastated. He said the court had overreacted. He said this kind of thing could follow people forever. I told him the order was temporary. He said that wasn't the point. He asked how I could do this to family. I asked him how he could watch a child be hit and say nothing. There was a long pause. Then he told me I was blowing things out of proportion. He said it was just a slap. That was the moment I stopped explaining. I told him the order stood. I told him any attempt to contact the boys would be documented. I told him he needed to decide where he stood. He accused me of being vindictive. He said I was punishing everyone over one mistake. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him I was done talking about it. I hung up before he could respond. That evening, I sat with the boys at the kitchen table, coloring quietly. Noah asked if Vivian was mad at him. I told him no. I told him adults are responsible for their actions. I told him he hadn't done anything wrong. He nodded, but I could see the question linger. Leo watched us closely, absorbing more than he said. I realized then that this wasn't just about stopping harm. It was about teaching them what protection looked like when it was real. In the days that followed, the calls came in waves. Family members asking what happened, telling me they were concerned, suggesting we all calm down. I answered once, then stopped. I focused on routines, school drop-offs, meals, bedtime stories, the ordinary structure that keeps children grounded when the world shifts beneath them. At night, though, the footage replayed in my head, the judge's expression, my father's voice. I wondered how many moments I'd dismissed before this one because they didn't leave marks. I wondered how close I'd come to losing something I couldn't replace. The protection order sat on the counter, a quiet presence. It wasn't justice. It wasn't closure. But it was a line clear, enforceable, and finally not negotiable. For the first time, I wasn't asking for permission to draw it. My father didn't disappear after the court order. He became louder, more persistent, as if volume could substitute for responsibility. He called from different numbers, left voicemails that swung between concern and accusation, sent messages framed as peace offerings that carried the same demand underneath them: undo this. Make it easier. Make it quiet again. When I finally answered, it wasn't because I was ready to reconcile. It was because I needed to hear him clearly without the buffer of hope. He started by saying he was worried about me, about how stressed I must be, about how far things had gone. Then almost casually he said it again, that phrase that had followed me my entire life, like a shadow I couldn't step out of. It was just a slap. I remember staring at the wall while he said it, tracing a small crack near the ceiling that I'd never noticed before. The house felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else now. I asked him if he'd watched the video. He said yes. I asked him if he'd heard the words she'd used. He said that wasn't the point. He told me I was focusing on the wrong thing. He said intent mattered. He said Vivian didn't mean to hurt anyone. He said families handle things internally. I told him a slap to the face of a child was not discipline. It was violence. I told him words that tell a child they don't belong, don't disappear once they're said. He sighed the way he always did when he thought I was being difficult. He said I was emotional. He said I'd always been sensitive. He said I was letting my feelings dictate reality. That was when I realized this conversation wasn't about Noah at all. It never had been. It was about preserving a version of the world where he didn't have to make a choice, where silence could still pass as neutrality, where standing back counted as staying out of it. I told him I wasn't rescinding the order. I told him Vivian would not be near my children again. I told him if he continued to minimize what happened, he wouldn't be either. There was a long pause. Then he asked me if I understood what I was risking. He said I was isolating myself. He said I was tearing the family apart. I told him the family had already done that. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long time, letting the weight of what I'd said settle. Cutting contact wasn't a dramatic decision. It didn't come with a sense of victory or relief. It felt like amputation, necessary, but final. My sister called later that evening. She'd heard a different version of events. One where Vivian was misunderstood, where I'd overreacted, where the court had been misled. She asked me why I was doing this. I asked her if she'd seen the video. She said she didn't need to. She trusted Dad. That told me everything. I stopped answering after that. I blocked numbers. I filtered emails. I made it clear through my attorney that communication would go through proper channels if it needed to happen at all. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was clean. No negotiations. No reframing. No pressure to explain myself into submission. The wedding date crept closer. Invitations had already gone out before everything happened, and now I faced decisions I'd never planned for. I removed names quietly without announcements. I hired security without telling anyone why. I filed copies of the protection order with the venue. Each step felt surreal, like I was planning an event for someone else's life. But beneath the logistics, there was a steadiness I hadn't expected. For once, I wasn't trying to manage other people's reactions. I was managing risk. At home, the boys adjusted in their own ways. Noah asked fewer questions as time passed, but he stayed close, always checking where I was in the room. He startled easily. Loud voices on television made him flinch. I found myself narrating ordinary things more than I used to: what we were doing next, who was coming over, when things would end, trying to rebuild a sense of predictability. Leo became protective in a way that broke my heart a little. He positioned himself between Noah and unfamiliar adults, even when there was no threat. I saw the lesson forming in him, the one I wished I'd learned earlier. Safety isn't guaranteed, but it can be defended. At night, after they were asleep, the questions came. Not doubts about my decision, but realizations about the past. Moments that resurfaced with new clarity. Times Vivian had corrected me in front of others. Times my father had asked me to apologize to keep the peace. Times I'd been told to understand someone else's stress while my own went unnamed. I wondered how many warnings I'd missed because they'd been delivered politely. The legal process continued in the background. Follow-ups, documentation, deadlines. Each interaction reinforced the same truth. What happened mattered. It was being recorded. It was being taken seriously. The system wasn't perfect, but it was structured in a way my family never had been. Facts mattered more than feelings. Evidence outweighed intention. One afternoon while sorting paperwork, I found an old photo tucked into a folder, me at 14 standing beside my father and Vivian smiling stiffly at the camera. I barely recognized myself. I looked compliant, eager, like I was trying to earn something that was never offered freely. I closed the folder and put it away. By the time the wedding arrived, the shape of my family had changed irrevocably. Not smaller, clearer. The people who remained were there without conditions. The ones who left had made their choices. I didn't celebrate that. I accepted it. Cutting contact wasn't about punishment. It was about refusing to participate in a story that required my children to be harmed so others could stay comfortable. And once I saw that clearly, there was no version of love that could justify going back. The baby shower had been years earlier, but after everything that happened, it came back to me with a clarity that felt almost surgical. At the time, I hadn't known what to call it. I'd filed it away as tension, as misunderstanding, as one more moment where I should have handled things better. Now I saw it for what it was, a rehearsal. When I was pregnant with Leo, Vivian barely acknowledged it. She asked practical questions, the kind that sound caring on the surface but never invite closeness. How far along? What the doctor said. Whether we'd thought about costs. She didn't touch my stomach. She didn't talk about names. When my mother called to ask if she could help plan a small shower, Vivian didn't object. She simply didn't participate. That changed after her son's marriage fell apart. Suddenly, Vivian was everywhere. She started referring to herself as grandma in public, testing the word like a claim. She sent articles about infant development. She asked about schedules, about discipline, about what kind of environment we planned to raise the baby in. It wasn't concern. It was assessment. And I told myself I was imagining the difference because admitting it would have meant acknowledging a pattern I wasn't ready to confront. I wanted something simple. Pizza. A few close friends. My mother. No games. No speeches. Just a gathering to mark a change without turning it into a performance. Vivian listened while I explained this, nodding in all the right places. She said it sounded lovely. She said she'd support whatever I wanted. Then she started making calls. She suggested a different venue, something more appropriate. She asked if my mother was comfortable hosting, implying she might be overwhelmed. She mentioned how certain relatives might feel left out. Each suggestion arrived wrapped in concern, and each one shifted the event a little further from what I'd asked for. When I pushed back, she reminded me that she had experience, that she was only trying to help, that I should be grateful. The final conversation happened 2 days before the shower. She called to say she'd taken care of decorations, that she'd found something elegant, that she'd be bringing them early to set the tone. I remember standing in the kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the calendar. I told her my mother had already arranged everything. She laughed lightly and said there was no harm in options. I hung up feeling unsettled, but I didn't act on it. I didn't want to start something. I didn't want to seem ungrateful. That was always the trap. It was my cousin who found out. She'd stopped by the venue earlier than planned to drop something off, and saw Vivian unloading boxes from her car, balloons, table runners, centerpieces in a color scheme I hadn't chosen. Vivian was directing the staff, explaining how things should look. My cousin called me from the parking lot, her voice tight. She asked if I knew about this. I said no. She didn't wait for instructions. She asked what I wanted to do. I told her to put everything back. When we arrived, the decorations Vivian had brought were stacked neatly in the garage. Nothing damaged, nothing thrown away. Just removed. The room looked exactly the way I'd planned, plain, warm, familiar. My mother was already there, arranging plates, smiling nervously like she was worried someone might take this from her. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. Vivian arrived 20 minutes later. She stopped just inside the door and looked around. She didn't ask questions. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, scanning the room, her eyes moving over every detail that didn't match her vision. Then she saw the boxes through the open garage door. Our eyes met for a moment. I waited for the confrontation. It never came. She sat down. The entire party passed in that strange, suspended quiet. Vivian didn't participate. She didn't help. She didn't criticize. She barely spoke. People noticed. A few asked if she was feeling well. She said she was tired. She left early without saying goodbye. No one mentioned it again. After that, she withdrew from Leo's life almost completely. Not dramatically, not with declarations. She simply stopped showing up. She missed birthdays. She declined invitations. When asked, she said she didn't want to overstep. At the time, I felt relieved. I told myself the issue had resolved itself. I didn't consider what it meant that her presence depended entirely on control. Looking back, that baby shower was the first time I saw what happened when her plans were quietly undone. No argument, no apology, just absence. It taught me something I wouldn't fully understand. Until much later, her involvement was conditional. If she couldn't shape the narrative, she would remove herself from it and let others fill in the blanks. That pattern repeated over and over again. I just hadn't had the language for it. Every boundary I set was treated as a personal attack. Every limit became proof that I was difficult. And every time I tried to smooth it over, I reinforced the idea that her comfort mattered more than my autonomy. By the time Noah came into our lives, the stakes were higher. This wasn't about parties or appearances. It was about safety. And when she crossed that line, the withdrawal didn't come. Control escalated instead. The difference was that this time I didn't rearrange myself to accommodate it. Remembering the baby shower now, I see how much I'd already learned without realizing it. I'd learned that quiet resistance could work, that removing yourself from a power struggle didn't mean you lost, and that people who need control more than connection will always choose control even if it costs them access. I didn't understand then that this lesson would eventually protect my children. I only knew that for the first time I hadn't apologized for wanting something small and true, and that refusal, so insignificant it almost disappeared, was the beginning of everything that followed. What I didn't understand at the time was how carefully that baby shower moment had been filed away. Vivian never brought it up, never argued about it, never accused me directly. She didn't need to. She simply remembered it. And when someone like her remembers a loss of control, it doesn't fade, it waits. After the court order, after the silence hardened into something permanent, that memory resurfaced in a different light. I began to see how often her plans had depended on being enacted quietly before anyone could object. How much of her power came from moving first, occupying space, forcing others to adjust around her presence. When that failed, when resistance appeared without spectacle, she didn't fight. She retreated and reframed herself as the injured party. That was exactly what happened next. Word traveled fast through the family, but it didn't travel intact. By the time it reached distant relatives, neighbors, even people I hadn't spoken to in years, the story had changed shape. Vivian hadn't hit a child. She'd been correcting him. She hadn't said he didn't belong. She'd been misunderstood. The restraining order wasn't protection, it was retaliation. I was unstable, overwhelmed, influenced by people who didn't care about family. I heard these versions secondhand through cautious messages and carefully worded questions. Are you okay? This seems serious. Maybe things escalated too quickly. Each one carried the same implication. If I were calmer, more reasonable, more forgiving, this wouldn't have happened. I didn't respond. I'd learned that explanations only invited negotiation, and I was done negotiating safety. Vivian, meanwhile, perfected her absence. She didn't show up uninvited. She didn't break the order. She didn't reach out directly. On paper, she was compliant. In practice, she was everywhere and nowhere at once. People spoke for her, interpreted for her, defended her without being asked. She became a presence defined by implication rather than action, which made her harder to confront and easier to excuse. The one thing she hadn't anticipated was how little access she actually had left. The wedding moved forward without her involvement, and with each decision made in her absence, something shifted. The venue staff followed my instructions without hesitation. The guest list stayed intact. The boys practiced walking down the aisle together, holding hands, laughing when they tripped over the carpet. There were no last-minute changes, no hidden arrangements, no quiet takeovers disguised as help. Vivian didn't show up early this time. She didn't show up at all. On the day of the wedding, the absence was noticeable, but it wasn't heavy. No one whispered. No one asked where my parents were. The space they would have occupied filled itself with something else, friends' laughter, the kind of ease that comes when no one is bracing for disruption. I realized then how much energy had gone into managing one person's potential reactions, and how much lighter everything felt without that weight. Security stood where they were supposed to. Not because I expected trouble, but because certainty had replaced hope. I wasn't waiting to see what might happen. I knew what would and wouldn't be allowed, and that knowledge created a calm I hadn't known before. Afterward, people told me the wedding felt peaceful, that it felt intentional. I nodded and smiled, knowing how much effort had gone into protecting that atmosphere. Not by controlling others, but by refusing to give control away. It was a few weeks later when Marcus reached out. He was Vivian's son from her first marriage, older than me by several years, someone I'd known only peripherally. We'd been polite at family gatherings, exchanged small talk, nothing more. When his name appeared on my phone, I considered not answering. Then I did. He didn't waste time. He said he'd been in therapy. He said he'd started asking questions about his childhood that didn't have easy answers. He said my name kept coming up, not because I was mentioned directly, but because of what wasn't said. He paused before telling me that Vivian had called him after the incident with Noah. She'd told him a different story, one where Noah had been aggressive, one where she'd intervened to protect another child, one where I'd panicked and exaggerated. Marcus told me he'd believed her at first. Then he saw the video. Someone had shown it to him. Not me, not my attorney, but a relative who couldn't reconcile the story they'd been told with what they'd witnessed. Marcus said watching it felt like something breaking loose inside him. Not anger. Recognition. He said he'd spent weeks replaying moments from his own childhood, realizing how often his mother's version of events had required him to doubt his own memory. He said he was sorry. I didn't know what to do with that. Apologies are complicated when they arrive late, carrying the weight of years they can't undo. I told him I appreciated the honesty. I told him the boys were safe. I didn't offer reconciliation. I didn't ask for explanation. He didn't push. A month later, he told me he'd cut contact with her. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't frame it as punishment. He said he needed distance to understand himself without her voice filling every gap. He said therapy had taught him that manipulation doesn't always look like cruelty. It often looks like certainty. He said he wished he'd questioned things sooner. I listened. I believed him. And I understood something then that I hadn't before. Recognition doesn't always come in time to prevent harm, but it still matters. Not because it fixes what happened, but because it stops the pattern from continuing unchecked. Vivian never acknowledged any of this. She maintained her silence. From the outside, it looked like restraint. I knew better. Silence was simply the last position available to her once access was removed. The family narrative adjusted again. Some people noticed. Others didn't. Life went on in uneven ways. What mattered to me was simpler. My children slept through the night. They spoke freely. They asked questions without fear of being corrected into smallness. The power Vivian once held depended on proximity. Once that was gone, all that remained were echoes. And echoes, I learned, lose their force when you stop answering them. The wedding took place in Portland on a quiet morning that felt deliberately removed from everything that had led up to it. We chose the date because it gave us distance: geographical, emotional, and legal. The venue sat just outside the city, surrounded by tall trees and long stretches of open space. It wasn't extravagant. It was calm. That mattered more to me than any aesthetic detail. We arrived early, not out of nerves, but out of habit. After months of preparing for disruption, being early felt like control. The coordinator walked us through the schedule. Security checked in discreetly, already familiar with the court order and the names attached to it. There was no drama, no tension in their voices, just procedure. I realized then how grounding that felt. Clear rules, clear roles. No improvisation required. Noah and Leo were already dressed, sitting side by side on a bench near the back of the room. They swung their legs in sync, whispering to each other, laughing quietly when they bumped shoes. Watching them, I felt something soften in my chest that I hadn't known was still tight. They weren't bracing. They weren't scanning the room. They were just children waiting for something good to happen. When the ceremony began, there were no empty seats that felt accusatory. No absence that demanded explanation. The people who were there had chosen to be there without conditions. Friends who had shown up quietly over the past year. Relatives who hadn't asked questions they weren't prepared to hear the answers to. My mother sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes wet but steady. She didn't look around. She didn't seem to notice who wasn't there. Her attention stayed exactly where it belonged. Noah walked first, holding the ring pillow carefully with both hands. He moved slowly, concentrating the way he did when something mattered to him. Leo followed, matching his pace without being told. They reached the front together and stood there, shoulders squared, serious and proud. I felt tears rise unexpectedly, not from sadness, but from relief. They were visible, included, unquestioned. As I walked down the aisle, I waited for the familiar surge of anxiety, the one that usually arrived at moments meant to be joyful. It didn't come. There was no voice in my head warning me to be careful, to manage expectations, to prepare for fallout. For the first time, I could remember I wasn't anticipating someone else's reaction. I was present. The ceremony itself passed quietly. Vows spoken without performance. Promises made with full awareness of what they cost. When it was over, when the room filled with applause, I felt something settle rather than explode. This wasn't a culmination. It was a beginning built on clarity instead of denial. Afterward, people hugged us, congratulated us, told us how peaceful everything felt. I thanked them and meant it. No one mentioned my father. No one asked about Vivian. The absence that had once loomed over every family gathering no longer had a place to land. Without access, without proximity, it held no power. That night, after the children were asleep in the hotel room, I stood by the window and watched the lights of the city in the distance. I thought about all the moments I'd imagined for this day that hadn't happened. The version of my father walking me down the aisle, the performance of unity I'd once believed was required for something to be real. I felt the loss of those images, but I didn't grieve them. They belonged to a story that no longer fit. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm that felt earned. We returned to Seattle and resumed routines that had been interrupted by months of tension: school mornings, grocery lists, ordinary conversations. The protection order remained in place, quietly doing its work. My father didn't reach out again. Neither did Vivian. The silence was no longer heavy. It was stable. It was during this stretch of calm that Marcus contacted me again. This time he asked if we could talk. Not about logistics. Not about the past in abstract terms. About him. About what he'd been uncovering in therapy. We met in a neutral place, a cafe near his office. He looked tired in a way that suggested effort rather than defeat. He spoke carefully, choosing his words as if they mattered now in a way they hadn't before. He told me about sessions where memories had surfaced unprompted, moments he'd dismissed as discipline, stories that had always been told one way now opening into something else. He said the video of Noah had cracked something open, but it wasn't the first fracture. It was just the first one he couldn't ignore. He said his mother had always explained conflict by assigning blame elsewhere, that she'd been convincing because she never sounded unsure. That certainty had been the most powerful tool in the room. He said learning to doubt it felt like learning a new language as an adult, slow, uncomfortable, necessary. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he said he understood if I didn't trust him. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He just wanted me to know he saw it now, that he believed me. I told him I appreciated that. I told him the boys were doing well. I didn't invite him into our lives. I didn't close the door either. The space between those decisions felt intentional. A month later, he sent a message letting me know he'd stopped speaking to his mother entirely. He said it wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of preservation. He said he needed to learn who he was without constant correction. I thought about that word, preservation, and how often it had been framed as selfishness in my family. How rarely it had been recognized as necessary. Watching my children move through the world now, unafraid to speak, unburdened by roles they didn't choose, I understood something with quiet certainty. Safety doesn't come from keeping people close. It comes from knowing when closeness is no longer safe. And for the first time, that knowledge felt like enough. Marcus didn't disappear after that conversation. He didn't flood my phone with messages either. What followed was something quieter and somehow heavier: consistency, short check-ins, occasional updates, no emotional demands attached. He didn't ask to see the boys. He didn't ask to be included. He seemed to understand that trust, if it came at all, would arrive slowly and without ceremony. One afternoon, months later, he called and asked if I remembered a story Vivian used to tell about him as a child. I did. It was one she repeated often, usually when someone questioned her parenting. She said Marcus had been difficult, defiant, prone to outbursts. She said she'd had no choice but to be firm. She said discipline was the only language he understood. Marcus told me that story had come up in therapy. He said the therapist asked him to describe a specific incident, the one Vivian always cited as proof that he'd needed strict control. As he spoke, details surfaced that had never made it into her version. How young he'd been, how confused. How he'd been punished not for misbehavior, but for asking questions. He said he'd spent most of his life accepting the label she'd given him because it explained why he felt perpetually wrong. It gave shape to the shame. Seeing the video of Noah had disrupted that narrative. Not because the situations were identical, but because the pattern was unmistakable. A child asking to belong, an adult responding with force, a story rewritten afterward to preserve authority. Marcus said the hardest part wasn't realizing she'd lied. It was realizing how often he'd helped her do it by doubting himself. I listened and felt something settle inside me. Not vindication, something closer to confirmation. The harm hadn't been isolated. It had been systemic, repeating itself until someone stepped out of reach. He told me that after cutting contact, Vivian had left multiple messages, calm ones, tearful ones, then angry ones. She accused him of abandoning her, of betraying family, of being manipulated by me, by therapists, by ideas that didn't value loyalty. He didn't respond. He let the messages sit until they stopped. He said the silence that followed was terrifying at first, then clarifying. Not long after that conversation, my father reached out again. It came through email, carefully worded as if legal language might make it safer. He said time had passed. He said emotions had cooled. He said perhaps it was time to reconsider things. He didn't mention the court order directly. He didn't mention Noah. He said he missed his grandchildren. He said families shouldn't stay broken forever. I read the message twice, then a third time. I noticed what wasn't there. No acknowledgement, no responsibility, no recognition of harm. Just an appeal to endurance, to history, to the idea that time alone could erase what had happened. I didn't respond. That silence felt different from the others. It wasn't protective. It was definitive. Later that week, Noah came home from school and told me he'd stood up to another child who'd taken his snack. He said he'd told the teacher instead of trying to handle it himself. He said he wasn't scared when he did it. I listened, nodded, and told him I was proud of him. After he ran off to play, I sat at the kitchen table and let myself feel the weight of that moment. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. Because it showed me how safety rewires instinct. Leo changed too, in subtler ways. He stopped hovering. He stopped watching adults so closely. He started inviting friends over without asking if it was okay first. He assumed the answer would be yes. That assumption felt like progress. Marcus eventually told me he'd started building relationships that didn't require explanation. Friends who didn't know his mother. Spaces where he didn't have to preemptively defend his choices. He said it felt like learning to breathe differently. He didn't frame it as healing. He framed it as orientation learning, where he stood when no one else was telling him. Vivian remained absent. From time to time, I heard fragments. She'd told someone she was respecting boundaries. She'd said she was giving space. She'd implied she was waiting for apologies. The narrative shifted depending on the audience. But the center stayed the same. She was the injured party, and everyone else was unreasonable. What surprised me was how little that mattered anymore. Without access, without proximity, her version of events lost traction. People who needed certainty gravitated toward it. People who valued clarity stepped away. The split became visible in ways it never had before. I stopped trying to manage it. One evening, as I tucked Noah into bed, he asked if Vivian was still mad at him. The question came softly, almost casually. I told him no. I told him some adults have trouble handling their feelings and that it wasn't his job to fix that. He nodded, satisfied, and rolled over. That was when I realized how far we'd come. The story no longer belonged to her. It no longer belonged to my father. It didn't even belong to Marcus, though his recognition had mattered. It belonged to the children who would grow up without being told to shrink in order to be kept. The final twist wasn't legal. It wasn't dramatic. It was this: the truth didn't need everyone to agree in order to be effective. It only needed enough distance to be seen clearly. By choosing safety, I hadn't destroyed my family. I'd exposed its fault lines. What collapsed under that exposure was never stable to begin with, and what remained quiet, unremarkable, steady, was something I'd never been taught to expect. Life didn't announce its return to normal. It eased back in quietly through routines that no longer carried tension underneath them. Mornings became predictable again. Breakfast dishes stacked in familiar ways. Shoes lined up by the door without reminders. The house in Seattle felt settled, not because nothing had happened, but because what had happened no longer dictated our movements. Noah turned 5 in the spring. He chose a small party at the park, cupcakes, a handful of friends from school, a scavenger hunt he helped plan himself. He didn't scan the crowd for threats. He didn't ask who might show up unexpectedly. When someone raised their voice across the playground, he flinched once, then kept running. That mattered to me more than any apology I never received. Leo grew taller, louder, more certain of his place. He stopped asking permission to speak in rooms that belonged to him. He argued back when he thought something was unfair, then accepted correction without folding into himself. I watched these shifts with a kind of cautious gratitude, aware that confidence isn't something you give children with speeches. It's something they absorb when the ground beneath them doesn't move. The protection order eventually expired. By then, it felt less like a shield and more like a marker evidence that we'd crossed into a different chapter. I didn't renew it. Not because I believed nothing could happen, but because boundaries had changed shape. Access was gone. Proximity was gone. The systems that once enabled harm no longer had a way in. My father never showed up at the door. He sent one final message months later, brief and careful, saying he hoped we were well. I didn't reply. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Contact without accountability had always cost more than it gave. I stopped expecting him to become someone else. Vivian faded into the background of other people's lives, a figure mentioned occasionally, usually with uncertainty. Some still defended her. Others avoided the subject entirely. I noticed how often people prefer not to choose sides when choosing would require them to look too closely at their own silences. I let them have that. Their comfort was no longer my responsibility. Marcus continued therapy. He shared updates sporadically, new insights, small breakthroughs, moments of grief he hadn't anticipated. We spoke a few times a year. Always respectfully. Always without assumptions. He never tried to reinsert himself. He didn't ask to be forgiven. He seemed focused on learning how to live without constant self-doubt. I recognized that effort. I respected it. One afternoon, while cleaning out a closet, I found an old box of documents I'd kept out of habit more than need. Court papers, notes I'd taken after the incident, copies of the video on labeled drives. I sat on the floor and sorted through them, slowly noticing how steady my hands were. When I was finished, I sealed the box and placed it back on the shelf, not out of fear, but out of record. Some things deserve to be remembered without being revisited. At night, when the house settled and the boys were asleep, I sometimes thought about the version of myself who would have tried to make peace at any cost. The one who believed endurance was the same as love. I felt tenderness for her, not regret. She had done what she knew how to do. I had learned something else. Safety, I realized, isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the absence of vigilance, in the way your shoulders drop when you turn the key in the door, in the way children assume they'll be believed, in the way silence no longer feels like a threat. I didn't win a battle. I didn't expose a villain in a single decisive moment. What happened unfolded slowly through choices that felt small at the time and irreversible later. I chose evidence over explanations, boundaries over approval, protection over proximity. Each choice closed a door. Together they opened a life. When people ask if I regret calling the police that night, I think of Noah's question the next morning whether he was in trouble. I think of Leo stepping between him and the world before he had the words to explain why. I think of the way both of them sleep now, deep and unguarded. And I know the answer. Family isn't where you endure harm to keep the peace. Family is where harm stops. Everything else is negotiation. There's a quiet kind of damage that doesn't leave visible scars. It settles into habits, into the way you hesitate before speaking, into the instinct to explain yourself even when you've done nothing wrong. For a long time, I thought endurance was proof of love, that if I stayed patient enough, understanding enough, everything would eventually soften. I was wrong. What I learned is simpler and harder to accept. Love that requires silence in the face of harm isn't love at all. It's conditioning. And the moment you stop participating in it, things don't always get better, but they do get honest. Choosing safety didn't make me brave. It made me responsible. Responsible for the children watching how adults handle fear. Responsible for the lessons they'll carry into their own lives about what they're allowed to tolerate. I didn't save them with one dramatic decision. I protected them by refusing to explain away what should never have happened. If this story stayed with you, maybe it's because you recognize that quiet conflict, the kind that happens behind closed doors, where no one raises their voice, but someone always pays the price. If that's you, I want you to know this: protecting yourself or your children doesn't make you cruel. It makes you awake. If you feel comfortable, share where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every comment and I'm grateful you're here. And if you found something meaningful in this story, thank you for supporting the channel by liking the video. Your presence, your time, and your attention truly matter.